Chapter 52 Part 3 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire Volume 5, Chapter 52, Part 3. In a private condition, our desires are perpetually repressed by poverty and subordination, but the lives and labors of millions are devoted to the service of a despotic prince, whose laws are blindly obeyed, and whose wishes are instantly gratified. Our imagination is dazzled by the splendid picture, and whatever may be the cool dictates of reason, there are few among us who would obstinately refuse a trial of the comforts and the cares of royalty. It may therefore be of some use to borrow the experience of the same Abd al Rahman, whose magnificence has perhaps excited our admiration and envy, and to transcribe an authentic memorial which was found in the closet of the deceased Caliph. I have now reigned about 50 years in victory or peace, beloved by my subjects, dreaded by my enemies, and respected by my allies. Riches and honors, power and pleasure, have waited on my call, nor does any earthly blessing appear to have been wanting to my felicity. In this situation I have diligently numbered the days of pure and genuine happiness which have fallen to my lot. They amount to 14. O man, place not thy confidence in this present world. The luxury of the caliphs, so useless to their private happiness, relaxed the nerves, and terminated the progress of the Arabian empire. Temporal and spiritual conquest had been the sole occupation of the first successors of Mahomet, and after supplying themselves with the necessaries of life, the whole revenue was scrupulously devoted to that salutary work. The Abbassides were impoverished by the multitude of their wants and their contempt of economy. Instead of pursuing the great object of ambition, their leisure, their affections, the powers of their mind, were diverted by pomp and pleasure. The rewards of valor were embezzled by women and eunuchs, and the royal camp was encumbered by the luxury of the palace. A similar temper was diffused among the subjects of the Caliph. Their stern enthusiasm was softened by time and prosperity. They sought riches in the occupations of industry, fame in the pursuits of literature, and happiness in the tranquillity of domestic life. War was no longer the passion of the Saracens, and the increase of pay, the repetition of donatives, were insufficient to allure the posterity of those voluntary champions who had crowded to the standard of Abubeker and Omar for the hopes of spoil and of paradise. Under the reign of the Ommiades, the studies of the Moslems were confined to the interpretation of the Koran, and the eloquence and poetry of their native tongue. A people continually exposed to the dangers of the field must esteem the healing powers of medicine, or rather of surgery, but the starving physicians of Arabia murmured a complaint that exercise and temperance deprived them of the greatest part of their practice. After their civil and domestic wars, the subjects of the Abbassides, awakening from this mental lethargy, found leisure and felt curiosity for the acquisition of profane science. The spirit was first encouraged by the Caliph Almansor, who, besides his knowledge of the Mahometan law, had applied himself with success to the study of astronomy. But when the sceptre devolved to Al-Mamun, the seventh of the Abbasides, he completed the designs of his grandfather, and invited the Muses from their ancient seats. His ambassadors at Constantinople, his agents in Armenia, Syria, and Egypt, collected the volumes of Grecian science. At his command they were translated by the most skilful interpreters into the Arabic language. His subjects were exhorted assiduously to pursue these instructive writings, and the successor of Mahomet assisted with pleasure and modesty at the assemblies and disputations of the learned. He was not ignorant, says Abu Faragius, that they are the elect of God, his best and most useful servants, whose lives are devoted to the improvement of their rational faculties. The mean ambition of the Chinese or the Turks may glory in the industry of their hands or the indulgence of their brutal appetites. Yet these dexterous artists must view, with hopeless emulation, the hexagons and pyramids of the cells of a beehive. These fortitudinous heroes are awed by the superior fierceness of the lions and tigers, and in their amorous enjoyments they are much inferior to the vigor of the grossest and most sordid quadrupeds. The teachers of wisdom are the true luminaries and legislators of a world, which, without their aid, would again sink in ignorance and barbarism. The zeal and curiosity of Almamon were imitated by succeeding princes of the line of Abbas. Their rivals, the Fatimites of Africa and the Ommiades of Spain, were the patrons of the learned, as well as the commanders of the faithful. The same royal prerogative was claimed by their independent emirs of the provinces, and their emulation diffused the taste and the rewards of science from Samarcand and Bokhara to Fez and Cordova. The vizier of the sultan consecrated a sum of 200,000 pieces of gold to the foundation of a college at Baghdad, which he endowed with an annual revenue of 15,000 dinars. The fruits of instruction were communicated, perhaps at different times, to 6,000 disciples of every degree, from the son of the noble to that of the mechanic. A sufficient allowance was provided for the indigent scholars, and the merit or industry of the professors was repaid with adequate stipends. In every city the productions of Arabic literature were copied and collected by the curiosity of the studious and the vanity of the rich. A private doctor refused the invitation of the Sultan of Bokhara, because the carriage of his books would have required 400 camels. The royal library of the Fatimites consisted of 100,000 manuscripts, elegantly transcribed and splendidly bound, which were lent, without jealousy or avarice, to the students of Cairo. Yet this collection must appear moderate, if we can believe that the Ommiades of Spain had formed a library of 600,000 volumes, 44 of which were employed in the mere catalogue. Their capital, Cordova, with the adjacent towns of Malaga, Almeria, and Murcia, had given birth to more than 300 writers, and above 70 public libraries were opened in the cities of the Andalusian kingdom. The age of Arabian learning continued about 500 years, till the great eruption of the Moguls, and was coeval with the darkest and most slothful period of European annals. But since the sun of science has arisen in the West, it should seem that the Oriental studies have languished and declined. In the libraries of the Arabians, as in those of Europe, the far greater part of the innumerable volumes were possessed only of local value or imaginary merit. Their shelves were crowded with orators and poets, whose style was adapted to the taste and manners of their countrymen, with general and partial histories, which each revolving generation supplied with a new harvest of persons and events, with codes and commentaries of jurisprudence, which derived their authority from the law of the prophet, with the interpreters of the Koran and orthodox tradition, and with the whole theological tribe, polemics, mystics, scholastics, and moralists, the first or the last of writers, according to the different estimates of skeptics or believers. The works of speculation or science may be reduced to the four classes of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and physic. The sages of Greece were translated and illustrated in the Arabic language, and some treatises, now lost in the original, have been recovered in the versions of the East, which possessed and studied the writings of Aristotle and Plato, of Euclid and Apollonius, of Ptolemy, Hippocrates, and Galen. Among the ideal systems which have varied with the fashion of the times, the Arabians adopted the philosophy of the Stagirite, alike intelligible or alike obscure for the readers of every age. Plato wrote for the Athenians, and his allegorical genius is too closely blended with the language and religion of Greece. After the fall of that religion, the Peripatetics, emerging from their obscurity, prevailed in the controversies of the Oriental sects, and their founder was long afterwards restored by the Mohammedans of Spain to the Latin schools. The physics, both of the Academy and the Lyceum, as they are built, not on observation but on argument, have retarded the progress of real knowledge. The metaphysics of infinite or finite spirit have too often been enlisted in the service of superstition. But the human faculties are fortified by the art and practice of dialectics. The 10 predicaments of Aristotle collect and methodize our ideas, and his syllogism is the keenest weapon of dispute. It was dexterously wielded in the schools of the Saracens, but as it is more effectual for the detection of error than for the investigation of truth, it is not surprising that new generations of masters and disciples should still revolve in the same circle of logical argument. The mathematics are distinguished by a peculiar privilege, that, in the course of ages, they may always advance, and can never recede. But the ancient geometry, if I am not misinformed, was resumed in the same state by the Italians of the 15th century, and whatever may be the origin of the name, the science of algebra is ascribed to the Grecian Diophantus by the modest testimony of the Arabs themselves. They cultivated with more success the sublime science of astronomy, which elevates the mind of man to disdain his diminutive planet and momentary existence. The costly instruments of observation were supplied by the Caliph Al Mamun, and the land of the Chaldeans still afforded the same spacious level, the same unclouded horizon. In the plains of Sinar, and a second time in those of Cufa, his mathematicians accurately measured a degree of the great circle of the earth, and determined at 24,000 miles the entire circumference of our globe. From the reign of the Abbassides to that of the grandchildren of Tamerlane, the stars, without the aid of glasses, were diligently observed, and the astronomical tables of Bagdad, Spain, and Samarcand correct some minute errors, without daring to renounce the hypothesis of Ptolemy, without advancing a step towards the discovery of the solar system. In the Eastern courts, the truth of science could be recommended only by ignorance and folly, and the astronomer would have been disregarded had he not debased his wisdom or honesty by the vain predictions of astrology. But in the science of medicine, the Arabians have been deservedly applauded. The names of Mesua and Geba, of Rhasis and Avicenna, are ranked with the Grecian masters. In the city of Bagdad, 860 physicians were licensed to exercise their lucrative profession. In Spain, the life of the Catholic princes was entrusted to the skill of the Saracens, and the school of Salerno, their legitimate offspring, revived in Italy and Europe the precepts of the healing art. The success of each professor must have been influenced by personal and accidental causes, but we may form a less fanciful estimate of their general knowledge of anatomy, botany, and chemistry, the threefold basis of their theory and practice. A superstitious reverence for the dead confined both the Greeks and the Arabians to the dissection of apes and quadrupeds. The more solid and visible parts were known in the time of Galen, and the finer scrutiny of the human frame was reserved for the microscope and the injections of modern artists. Botany is an active science, and the discoveries of the torrid zone might enrich in the herbal of Dioscorides with 2,000 plants. Some traditionary knowledge might be secreted in the temples and monasteries in Egypt. Much useful experience had been acquired in the practice of arts and manufactures. But the science of chemistry owes its origin and improvement to the industry of the Saracens. They first invented and named the alembic for the purposes of distillation, analyzed the substances of the three kingdoms of nature, tried the distinction and affinities of alkalis and acids, and converted the poisonous minerals into soft and salutary medicines. But the most eager search of Arabian chemistry was the transmutation of metals, and the elixir of immortal health. The reason and the fortunes of thousands were evaporated in the crucibles of alchemy, and the consummation of a great work was promoted by the worthy aid of mystery, fable, and superstition. But the Moslems deprived themselves of the principal benefits of a familiar intercourse with Greece and Rome, the knowledge of antiquity, the purity of taste, and the freedom of thought. Confident in the riches of their native tongue, the Arabians disdained the study of any foreign idiom. The Greek interpreters were chosen among their Christian subjects; they formed their translations, sometimes on the original text, more frequently, perhaps, on a Syriac version; and in the crowd of astronomers and physicians, there is no example of a poet, an orator, or even an historian, being taught to speak the language of the Saracens. The mythology of Homer would have provoked the adherence of those stern fanatics. They possessed in lazy ignorance the colonies of the Macedonians, and the provinces of Carthage and Rome. The heroes of Plutarch and Livy were buried in oblivion, and the history of the world before Mahomet was reduced to a short legend of the patriarchs, the prophets, and the Persian kings. Our education in the Greek and Latin schools may have fixed in our minds a standard of exclusive taste, and I am not forward to condemn the literature and judgment of nations, of whose language I am ignorant. Yet I know that the classics have much to teach, and I believe that the Orientals have much to learn. The temperate dignity of style, the graceful proportions of art, the forms of visible and intellectual beauty, the just delineation of character and passion, the rhetoric of narrative and argument, the regular fabric of epic and dramatic poetry. The influence of truth and reason is of a less ambiguous complexion. The philosophers of Athens and Rome enjoyed the blessings and asserted the rights of civil and religious freedom. Their moral and political writings might have gradually unlocked the fetters of Eastern despotism, diffused a liberal spirit of inquiry and toleration, and encouraged the Arabian sage to suspect that their caliph was a tyrant, and their prophet an impostor. The instinct of superstition was alarmed by the introduction even of the abstract sciences, and the more rigid doctors of the law condemned the rash and pernicious curiosity of Al Mamun. To the thirst of martyrdom, the vision of paradise, and the belief of predestination, we must ascribe the invincible enthusiasm of the prince and people. And the sword of the Saracens became less formidable when their youth was drawn away from the camp to the college, when the armies of the faithful presumed to read and to reflect. Yet the foolish vanity of the Greeks was jealous of their studies, and reluctantly imparted the sacred fire to the barbarians of the East. In the bloody conflict of the Ommiades and Abbassides, the Greeks had stolen the opportunity of avenging their wrongs and enlarging their limits. But a severe retribution was exacted by Mohaddii, the third caliph of the new dynasty, who seized, in his turn, the favorable opportunity, while a woman and a child, Irene and Constantine, were seated on the Byzantine throne. An army of 95,000 Persians and Arabs was sent from the Tigris to the Thracian Bosphorus, under the command of Harun, or Aaron, the second son of the commander of the faithful. His encampment on the opposite heights of Chrysopolis, or Scutari, informed Irene, in her palace of Constantinople, of the loss of her troops and provinces. With the consent or connivance of their sovereign, her ministers subscribed an ignominious peace, and the exchange of some royal gifts could not disguise the annual tribute of 70,000 dinars of gold, which was imposed of the Roman empire. The Saracens had too rashly advanced into the midst of a distant and hostile land. Their retreat was solicited by the promise of faithful guides and plentiful markets, and not a Greek had courage to whisper that their weary forces might be surrounded and destroyed in their necessary passage between a slippery mountain and the river Sangarius. 5 years after this expedition, Harun ascended the throne of his father and his elder brother, the most powerful and vigorous monarch of his race, illustrious to the West as the ally of Charlemagne, and familiar to the most childish readers as the perpetual hero of the Arabian tales. His title to the name of Al Rashid, the Just, is sullied by the extirpation of the generous, perhaps the innocent, Barmecides. Yet he could listen to the complaint of the poor widow. who had been pillaged by his troops, and who dared, in a passage of the Koran, to threaten the inattentive despot with the judgment of God and posterity. His court was adorned with luxury and science; but in a reign of 23 years, Harun repeatedly visited these provinces from Khorasan to Egypt. 9 times he performed the pilgrimage to Mecca. 8 times he invaded the territories of the Romans; and as often as they declined the payment of the tribute, they were taught to feel that a month of depredation was more costly than a year of submission. But when the unnatural mother of Constantine was deposed and banished, her successor, Nicephorus, resolved to obliterate this badge of servitude and disgrace. The epistle of the emperor to the caliph was pointed with an allusion to the game of chess, which had already spread from Persia to Greece. The queen, he spoke of Irene, considered you as a rook, and herself as a pawn. That pusillanimous female submitted to pay a tribute the double of which she ought to have exacted from the barbarians. Restore therefore the fruits of your injustice, or abide the determination of the sword." At these words the ambassadors cast a bundle of swords before the foot of the throne. The caliph smiled at the menace, and drawing his scimitar, Samsamah, a weapon of historic or fabulous renown, he cut asunder the feeble arms of the Greeks without turning the edge or endangering the temper of his blade. He then dictated an epistle of tremendous brevity. "In the name of the most merciful God, Harun al Rashid, commander of the faithful, to Nicephorus, the Roman dog. I have read thy letter, O thou son of an unbelieving mother. Thou shalt not hear, thou shalt behold my reply." It was written in characters of blood and fire on the plains of Phrygia, and the warlike celerity of the Arabs could only be checked by the arts of deceit and the show of repentance. The triumphant caliph retired, after the fatigues of the campaign, to his favorite palace of Raqqa on the Euphrates, but the distance of 500 miles, and the inclemency of the season, encouraged his adversary to violate the peace. Nicephorus was astonished by the bold and rapid march of the commander of the faithful, who repassed in the depth of winter the snows of Mount Taurus. His stratagems of policy and war were exhausted, and the perfidious Greek escaped with 3 wounds from a field of battle overspread with 40,000 of his subjects. Yet the emperor was ashamed of submission, and the caliph was resolved on victory. 135,000 regular soldiers received pay, and were inscribed in the military roll, and above 300,000 persons of every denomination marched under the black standard of the Abbassides. They swept the surface of Asia Minor far beyond Tyana and Ancyra, and invested the Pontic Heraclea, once a flourishing state, now a paltry town, at that time capable of sustaining, in her antique walls, a month's siege against the forces of the East. The ruin was complete, the spoil was ample. But if Harun had been conversant with Grecian story, he would have regretted the statue of Hercules, whose attributes, the club, the bow, the quiver, and the lion's hide, were sculptured in massy gold. The progress of desolation by sea and land, from the Euxine to the Isle of Cyprus, compelled the Emperor Nicephorus to retract his haughty defiance. In the new treaty, the ruins of Heraclea were left forever as a lesson and a trophy, and the coin of the tribute was marked with the image and superscription of Harun and his 3 sons. Yet this plurality of lords might contribute to remove the dishonor of the Roman name. After the death of their father, the heirs of the caliph were involved in civil discord, and the conqueror, the liberal Almamon, was sufficiently engaged in the restoration of domestic peace and the introduction of foreign science. End of the chapter 52, part 3. Chapter 52, part 4 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 52, Part 4. Under the reign of Al-Mamun at Baghdad, of Michael the Stammerer at Constantinople, the islands of Crete and Sicily were subdued by the Arabs. The former of these conquests is disdained by their own writers, who were ignorant of the fame of Jupiter and Minos, but it has not been overlooked by the Byzantine historians, who now begin to cast a clear light on the affairs of their own times. A band of Andalusian volunteers, discontented with the climate or government of Spain, explored their adventures by sea, but as they sailed in no more than 10 or 20 galleys, their warfare must be branded with the name of piracy. As the subjects and sectaries of the white party, they might lawfully invade the dominions of the Black Caliphs. A rebellious faction introduced them into Alexandria. They cut in pieces both friends and foes, pillaged the churches and the mosques, sold above 6,000 Christian captives, and maintained their station in the capital of Egypt, till they were oppressed by the forces and the presence of Al-Mamun himself. From the mouth of the Nile to the Hellespont, the islands and seacoasts both of the Greeks and Moslems were exposed to their depredations. They saw, they envied, they tasted the fertility of Crete, and soon returned with 40 galleys to a more serious attack. The Andalusians wandered over the land fearless and unmolested. But when they descended with their plunder to the seashore, their vessels were in flames, and their chief, Abu Ka'ab, confessed himself the author of the mischief. Their clamors accused his madness or treachery. "Of what do you complain?" replied the crafty Emir. "I have brought you to a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is your true country. Repose from your toils, and forget the barren place of your nativity." "And our wives and children?" "Your beauteous captives will supply the place of your wives, and in their embraces you will soon become the fathers of a new progeny." The first habitation was their camp, with a ditch and rampart, in the Bay of Suda, but an apostate monk led them to a more desirable position in the eastern parts, and the name of Kandax, their fortress and colony, has been extended to the whole island, under the corrupt and modern appellation of Candia. The 100 cities of the age of Minos were diminished to 30, and of these only one, most probably Cydonia, had courage to retain the substance of freedom and the profession of Christianity. The Saracens of Crete soon repaired the loss of their navy, and the timbers of Mount Ida were launched into the main. During a hostile period of 138 years, the princes of Constantinople attacked these licentious corsairs with fruitless curses and ineffectual arms. The loss of Sicily was occasioned by an act of superstitious rigor. An amorous youth, who had stolen a nun from her cloister, was sentenced by the emperor to the amputation of his tongue. Euphemius appealed to the reason and policy of the Saracens of Africa, and soon returned with the imperial purple, a fleet of 100 ships, and an army of 700 horse and 10,000 foot. They landed at Mazara near the ruins of the ancient Selinus, but after some partial victories, Syracuse was delivered by the Greeks. The apostate was slain before her walls, and his African friends were reduced to the necessity of feeding on the flesh of their own horses. In their turn they were relieved by a powerful reinforcement of their brethren of Andalusia. The largest and western part of the island was gradually reduced, and the commodious harbor of Palermo was chosen for the seat of the naval and military power of the Saracens. Syracuse preserved about 50 years the faith which she had sworn to Christ and to Caesar. In the last and fatal siege, her citizens displayed some remnant of the spirit which had formerly resisted the powers of Athens and Carthage. They stood about 20 days against the battering rams and catapult the mines and tortoises of the besiegers; and the place might have been relieved, if the mariners of the Imperial fleet had not been detained at Constantinople in building a church to the Virgin Mary. The diacon Theodosius, with the bishop and clergy, was dragged in chains from the altar to Palermo, cast into a subterraneous dungeon, and exposed to the hourly peril of death or apostasy. His pathetic and not inelegant complaint may be read as the epitaph of his country. From the Roman conquest to this final calamity, Syracuse, now dwindled to the primitive isle of Ortygia, had insensibly declined. Yet the relics were still precious. The plate of the cathedral weighed 5,000 pounds of silver. The entire spoil was computed at 1,000,000 of pieces of gold, about 400,000 pounds sterling; and the captives must outnumber the 17,000 Christians, who were transported from the sack of Tauromenium into African servitude. In Sicily, the religion and language of the Greeks were eradicated; and such was the docility of the rising generation, that 15,000 boys were circumcised and clothed on the same day with the son of the Fatimite caliph. The Arabian squadrons issued from the harbors of Palermo, Biserta, and Tunis. 150 towns of Calabria and Campania were attacked and pillaged; nor could the suburbs of Rome be defended by the name of the Caesars and Apostles. Had the Mahometans been united, Italy must have fallen an easy and glorious accession to the empire of the Prophet. But the caliphs of Bagdad had lost their authority in the West. The Aglabites and Fatimites usurped the provinces of Africa. Their emirs of Sicily aspired to independence, and the design of conquest and dominion was degraded to a repetition of predatory inroads. In the sufferings of prostrate Italy, the name of Rome awakens a solemn and mournful recollection. A fleet of Saracens from the African coast presumed to enter the mouth of the Tiber, and to approach a city which even yet, in her fallen state, was revered as the metropolis of the Christian world. The gates and ramparts were guarded by a trembling people; but the tombs and temples of St. Peter and St. Paul were left exposed in the suburbs of the Vatican and of the Ostian Way. Their invisible sanctity had protected them against the Goths, the Vandals, and the Lombards; but the Arabs disdained both the gospel and the legend, and their rapacious spirit was approved and animated by the precepts of the Koran. The Christian idols were stripped of their costly offerings; a silver altar was torn away from the shrine of St. Peter; and if the bodies or the buildings were left entire, their deliverance must be imputed to the haste, rather than the scruples, of the Saracens. In their course along the Appian Way, they pillaged Fundi and besieged Gayeta; but they had turned aside from the walls of Rome, and by their divisions the capital was saved from the yoke of the prophet of Mecca. The same danger still impended on the heads of the Roman people, and their domestic force was unequal to the assault of an African emir. They claimed the protection of their Latin sovereign; but the Carlovingian standard was overthrown by attachment of the barbarians. They meditated the restoration of the Greek emperors; but the attempt was treasonable, and the succor remote and precarious. Their distress appeared to receive some aggravation from the death of their spiritual and temporal chief; but the pressing emergency superseded the forms and intrigues of an election, and the unanimous choice of Pope Leo the Fourth was the safety of the church and city. This pontiff was born a Roman; the courage of the first ages of the republic glowed in his breast; and, amidst the ruins of his country, he stood erect, like one of the firm and lofty columns that rear their heads above the fragments of the Roman Forum. The first days of his reign were consecrated to the purification and removal of relics, to prayers and processions, and to all the solemn offices of religion, which served at least to heal the imagination and restore the hopes of the multitude. The public defence had been long neglected, not from the presumption of peace, but from the distress and poverty of the times. As far as the scantiness of his means and the shortness of his leisure would allow, the ancient walls were repaired by the command of Leo. 15 towers, in the most accessible stations, were built or renewed. 2 of these commanded on either side of the Tiber, and an iron chain was drawn across the stream to impede the ascent of a hostile navy. The Romans were assured of a short respite by the welcome news that the siege of Gayeta had been raised, and that a part of the enemy, with their sacrilegious plunder, had perished in the waves. But the storm, which had been delayed, soon burst upon them with redoubled violence. The Aglabite, who reigned in Africa, had inherited from his father a treasure and an army. A fleet of Arabs and Moors, after a short refreshment in the harbors of Sardinia, cast anchor before the mouth of the Tiber, 16 miles from the city, and their discipline and numbers appeared to threaten, not a transient inroad, but a serious design of conquest and dominion. But the vigilance of Leo had formed an alliance with the vassals of the Greek empire, the free and maritime states of Gayeta, Naples, and Amalfi; and in the hour of danger their galleys appeared in the port of Ostia under the command of Caesarius, the son of the Neapolitan duke, a noble and valiant youth, who had already vanquished the fleets of the Saracens. With his principal companions, Caesarius was invited to the Lateran palace, and the dexterous pontiff affected to inquire their errand, and to accept with joy and surprise their providential succor. The city bands in arms attended their father to Ostia, where he reviewed and blessed his generous deliverers. They kissed his feet, received the communion with martial devotion, and listened to the prayer of Leo, that the same God who had supported St. Peter and St. Paul on the waves of the sea would strengthen the hands of his champions against the adversaries of his holy name. After a similar prayer, and with equal resolution, the Moslems advanced to the attack of the Christian galleys, which preserved their advantageous station along the coast. The victory inclined to the side of the allies, when it was less gloriously decided in their favor by a sudden tempest, which confounded the skill and courage of the stoutest mariners. The Christians were sheltered in a friendly harbor, while the Africans were scattered and dashed in pieces among the rocks and islands of a hostile shore. Those who escaped from shipwreck and hunger neither found nor deserved mercy at the hands of their implacable pursuers. The sword and the gibbet reduced the dangerous multitude of captives, and the remainder was more usefully employed to restore the sacred edifices which they had attempted to subvert. The pontiff, at the head of the citizens and allies, paid his grateful devotion at the shrines of the apostles, and, among the spoils of this naval victory, 13 Arabian bows of pure and massy silver were suspended round the altar of the fishermen of Galilee. The reign of Leo IV. Was employed in the defense and ornament of the Roman state. The churches were renewed and embellished. Near 4,000 pounds of silver were consecrated to repair the losses of St. Peter, and his sanctuary was decorated with a plate of gold of the weight of 216 pounds, embossed with the portraits of the Pope and Emperor, and encircled with a string of pearls. Yet this vain magnificence reflects less glory on the character of Leo than the paternal care with which he rebuilt the walls of Horta and Ameria, and transported the wandering inhabitants of Centumcellae to his new foundation of Leopolis, 12 miles from the seashore. By his liberality, a colony of Corsicans, with their wives and children, was planted in the station of Porto, at the mouth of the Tiber. The falling city was restored for their use. The fields and vineyards were divided among the new settlers. Their first efforts were assisted by a gift of horses and cattle, and the hardy exiles who breathed revenge against the Saracens swore to live and die under the standard of St. Peter. The nations of the West and North who visited the threshold of the Apostles had gradually formed the large and populous suburb of the Vatican, and their various habitations were distinguished, in the language of the times, as the schools of the Greeks and Goths, of the Lombards and Saxons. But this venerable spot was still open to sacrilegious insult. The design of enclosing it with walls and towers exhausted all that authority could command, or charity would supply. And the pious labor of 4 years was animated in every season and at every hour by the presence of the indefatigable pontiff. The love of fame, a generous but worldly passion, may be detected in the name of the Leonine city, which he bestowed on the Vatican. Yet the pride of the dedication was tempered with Christian penance and humility. The boundary was trod by the bishop and his clergy, barefoot, in sackcloth and ashes. The songs of triumph were modulated to psalms and litanies. The walls were besprinkled with holy water, and the ceremony was concluded with a prayer, that, under the guardian care of the apostles and the angelic host, both the old and the new Rome might ever be preserved pure, prosperous, and impregnable. The Emperor Theophilus, son of Michael the Stammerer, was one of the most active and high-spirited princes who reigned at Constantinople during the Middle Age. In offensive or defensive war, he marched in person 5 times against the Saracens, formidable in his attack, esteemed by the enemy in his losses and defeats. In the last of those expeditions he penetrated into Syria, and besieged the obscure town of Sozopetra, the casual birthplace of the Caliph Motassem, whose father Harun was attended in peace or war by the most favored of his wives and concubines. The revolt of a Persian impostor employed at that moment the arms of the Saracen, and he could only intercede in favor of a place for which he felt and acknowledged some degree of filial affection. These solicitations determined the emperor to wound his pride in so sensible a part. Sozopetra was levelled with the ground, the Syrian prisoners were marked or mutilated with ignominious cruelty, and 1,000 female captives were forced away from the adjacent territory. Among these a matron of the house of Abbas invoked, in an agony of despair, the name of Motassem, and the insults of the Greeks engaged the honor of her kinsman to avenge his indignity, and to answer her appeal. Under the reign of the 2 elder brothers, the inheritance of the youngest had been confined to Anatolia, Armenia, Georgia, and Circassia. This frontier station had exercised his military talents, and among his accidental claims to the name of Octonary, the most meritorious are the 8 battles which he gained or fought against the enemies of the Koran. In this personal quarrel, the troops of Iraq, Syria, and Egypt were recruited from the tribes of Arabia and the Turkish hordes. His cavalry might be numerous, though we should deduct some myriads from the 130,000 horses of the royal stables, and the expense of the armament was computed at 4 millions sterling, or 100,000 pounds of gold. From Tarsus, the place of assembly, the Saracens advanced in 3 divisions along the high road of Constantinople. Motassem himself commanded the centre, and the vanguard was given to his son Abbas, who, in the trial of the first adventurers, might succeed with the more glory, or fail with the least reproach. In the revenge of his injury, the Caliph prepared to retaliate a similar affront. The father of Theophilus was a native of Amorium in Phrygia. The original seat of the imperial house had been adorned with privileges and monuments, and, whatever might be the indifference of the people, Constantinople itself was scarcely of more value in the eyes of the sovereign and his court. The name of Amorium was inscribed on the shields of the Saracens, and their 3 armies were again united under the walls of the devoted city. It had been proposed by the wisest counsellors to evacuate Amorium, to remove the inhabitants, and to abandon the empty structures to the vain resentment of the barbarians. The emperor embraced the more generous resolution of defending, in a siege and battle, the country of his ancestors. When the armies drew near, the front of the Mahometan line appeared to a Roman eye more closely planted with spears and javelins. But the event of the action was not glorious on either side to the national troops. The Arabs were broken, but it was by the swords of 30,000 Persians who had obtained service and settlement in the Byzantine empire. The Greeks were repulsed and vanquished, and it was by the arrows of the Turkish cavalry; and had not their bowstrings been damped and relaxed by the evening rain, very few of the Christians could have escaped with the emperor from the field of the battle. They breathed at Dorylaeum, at the distance of 3 days, and Theophilus, reviewing his trembling squadrons, forgave the common flight both of the prince and people. After this discovery of his weakness, he vainly hoped to deprecate the fate of Amorium. The inexorable caliph rejected with contempt his prayers and promises, and detained the Roman ambassadors to be the witnesses of his great revenge. They had nearly been the witnesses of his shame. The vigorous assaults of 55 days were encountered by a faithful governor, a veteran garrison, and a desperate people; and the Saracens must have raised the siege, if a domestic traitor had not pointed to the weakest part of the wall, a place which was decorated with the statues of a lion and a bull. The vow of Motassem was accomplished with unrelenting rigor. Tired, rather than satiated, with distraction, he returned to his new palace of Samara, in the neighborhood of Bagdad, while the unfortunate Theophilus implored the tardy and doubtful aid of his western rival, the emperor of the Franks. Yet in the siege of Amorium about 70,000 Moslems had perished. Their loss had been revenged by the slaughter of 30,000 Christians, and the sufferings of an equal number of captives, who were treated as the most atrocious criminals. Mutual necessity could sometimes extort the exchange or ransom of prisoners, but in the national and religious conflict of the two empires, peace was without confidence, and war without mercy. Quarter was seldom given in the field; those who escaped the edge of the sword were condemned to hopeless servitude or exquisite torture; and the Catholic emperor relates, with visible satisfaction, the execution of the Saracens of Crete, who were flayed alive, or plunged into caldrons of boiling oil. To a point of honor Motassem had sacrificed a flourishing city, 200,000 lives, and the property of millions. The same caliph descended from his horse, and dirtied his robe, to relieve the distress of a decrepit old man, who, with his laden ass, had tumbled into a ditch. On which of these actions did he reflect with the most pleasure, when he was summoned by the angel of death? With Motassem, the eighth of the Abbassides, the glory of his family and nation expired. When the Arabian conquerors had spread themselves over the East, and were mingled with the servile crowds of Persia, Syria, and Egypt, they insensibly lost the free-born and martial virtues of the desert. The courage of the South is the artificial fruit of discipline and prejudice. The active power of enthusiasm had decayed, and the mercenary forces of the caliphs were recruited in those climates of the North, of which valor is the hardy and spontaneous production. Of the Turks who dwelt beyond the Oxus and Jaxartes, the robust youths, either taken in war or purchased in trade, were educated in the exercises of the field, and the profession of the Mahometan faith. The Turkish guard stood in arms round the throne of their benefactor, and their chiefs usurped the dominion of the palace and the provinces. Motassem, the first author of this dangerous example, introduced into the capital above 50,000 Turks. Their licentious conduct provoked the public indignation, and the quarrels of the soldiers and people induced the caliph to retire from Bagdad, and establish his own residence and the camp of his barbarian favorites at Samara on the Tigris, about 12 leagues above the city of peace. His son Motawakkel was a jealous and cruel tyrant. Odious to his subjects, he cast himself on the fidelity of the strangers, and these strangers, ambitious and apprehensive, were tempted by the rich promise of a revolution. At the instigation, or at least in the cause of his son, they burst into his apartment at the hour of supper, and the Caliph was cut into 7 pieces by the same swords which he had recently distributed among the guards of his life and throne. To this throne, yet streaming with the father's blood, Montasser was triumphantly led; but, in a reign of 6 months, he found only the pangs of a guilty conscience. If he wept at the sight of an old tapestry which represented the crime and punishment of the son of Chosroes, if his days were abridged by grief and remorse, we may allow some pity to a parricide, who exclaimed, in the bitterness of death, that he had lost both this world and the world to come. After this act of treason, the ensigns of royalty, the garment and walking staff of Mahomet, were given and torn away by the foreign mercenaries, who, in 4 years, created, deposed, and murdered 3 commanders of the faithful. As often as the Turks were inflamed by fear, or rage, or avarice, these caliphs were dragged by the feet, exposed naked to the scorching sun, beaten with iron clubs, and compelled to purchase, by the abdication of their dignity, a short reprieve of inevitable fate. At length, however, the fury of the tempest was spent or diverted. The Abbassides returned to the less turbulent residents of Bagdad. The insolence of the Turks was curbed with a firmer and more skilful hand, and their numbers were divided and destroyed in foreign warfare. But the nations of the East had been taught to trample on the successors of the Prophet, and the blessings of domestic peace were obtained by the relaxation of strength and discipline. So uniform are the mischiefs of military despotism, that I seem to repeat the story of the Praetorians of Rome. While the flame of enthusiasm was damped by the business, the pleasure, and the knowledge of the age, it burned with consecrated heat in the breasts of the chosen few, the congenial spirits, who were ambitious of reigning either in this world or in the next. How carefully soever the book of prophecy had been sealed by the apostle of Mecca, the wishes and, if we may profane the word, even the reason, of fanaticism might believe that, after the successive missions of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, and Mahomet, the same God, in the fullness of time, would reveal a still more perfect and permanent law. In the 277th year of the Hegira, and in the neighborhood of Cufa, an Arabian preacher, of the name of Khamas, assumed the lofty and incomprehensible style of the guide, the director, the demonstration, the word, the Holy Ghost, the camel, the herald of the Messiah, who can converse with him in a human shape, and the representative of Mohammed, the son of Ali, of Saint John the Baptist, and of the angel Gabriel. In his mystic volume, the precepts of the Koran were refined to a more spiritual sense. He relaxed the duties of ablution, fasting, and pilgrimage, allowed the indiscriminate use of wine and forbidden food, and nourished the fervor of his disciples by the daily repetition of 50 prayers. The idleness and ferment of the rustic crowd awakened the attention of the magistrates of Cufa. A timid persecution assisted the progress of the new sect, and the name of the prophet became more revered after his person had been withdrawn from the world. His 12 apostles dispersed themselves among the Bedoweens, a race of men, says Abu Feda, equally devoid of reason and of religion. And the success of their preaching seemed to threaten Arabia with a new revolution. The Carmasians were ripe for rebellion, since they disclaimed the title of the house of Abbas, and abhorred the worldly pomp of the caliphs of Bagdad. They were susceptible of discipline, since they vowed a blind and absolute submission to their imam, who was called to the prophetic office by the voice of God and the people. Instead of the legal tithe, he claimed the fifths of their substance and spoil. The most flagitious sins were no more than the type of disobedience, and the brethren were united and concealed by an oath of secrecy. After a bloody conflict they prevailed in the province of Bahrein, along the Persian Gulf. Far and wide, the tribes of the desert were subject to the sceptre, or rather to the sword of Abu Said and his son Abu Taher. and these rebellious imams could muster in the field 107,000 fanatics. The mercenaries of the caliph were dismayed at the approach of an enemy who neither asked nor accepted quarter, and the difference between them in fortitude and patience is expressive of the change which 3 centuries of prosperity had effected in the character of the Arabians. Such troops were discomfited in every action; the cities of Raqqa and Baalbek, of Kaffa and Bassora, were taken and pillaged. Bagdad was filled with consternation, and the caliph trembled behind the veils of his palace. In a daring inroad beyond the Tigris, Abu Taher advanced to the gates of the capital with no more than 500 horse. By the special order of Moqtadir, the bridges had been broken down, and the person or head of the rebel was expected every hour by the commander of the faithful. His lieutenant, from a motive of fear or pity, apprised Abu Taher of his danger, and recommended a speedy escape. "Your master," said the intrepid Carmathian to the messenger, "is at the head of 30,000 soldiers. 3 such men as these are wanting in his host." At the same instant, turning to 3 of his companions, he commanded the first to plunge a dagger into his breast, the second to leap into the Tigris, and the third to cast himself headlong down a precipice. They obeyed without a murmur. "Relate," continued the imam, "what you have seen. Before the evening your general shall be chained among my dogs." Before the evening the camp was surprised and the menace was executed. The rapine of the Carmathians was sanctified by their aversion to the worship of Mecca. They robbed a caravan of pilgrims, and 20,000 devout Moslems were abandoned on the burning sands to the death of hunger and thirst. Another year they suffered the pilgrims to proceed without interruption, but in the festival of devotion Abu Taher stormed the holy city, and trampled on the most venerable relics of the Mahometan faith. 30,000 citizens and strangers were put to the sword. The sacred precincts were polluted by the burial of 3,000 dead bodies. The well of Zamzam overflooded with blood. The golden spout was forced from its place. The veil of the Kaaba was divided among these impious sectaries, and the black stone, the first monument of the nation, was borne away in triumph to their capital. After this deed of sacrilege and cruelty, they continued to infest the confines of Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. But the vital principle of enthusiasm had withered at the root. Their scruples or their avarice again opened the pilgrimage of Mecca, and restored the black stone of the Kaaba; and it is needless to inquire into what factions they were broken, or by whose swords they were finally extirpated. The sect of the Carmathians may be considered as the second visible cause of the decline and fall of the empire of the Caliphs. End of chapter 52, part 4. Chapter 52, part 5 of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Christine. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 52, Part 5. The third and most obvious cause was the weight and magnitude of the empire itself. The Caliph Al Mamun might proudly assert that it was easier for him to rule the East and the West than to manage a chessboard of 2 feet square; yet I suspect that in both those games he was guilty of many fatal mistakes, and I perceive that in the distant provinces the authority of the first and most powerful of the Abbassides was already impaired. The analogy of despotism invests the representative with the full majesty of the prince. The division and balance of powers might relax the habits of obedience, might encourage the passive subject to inquire into the origin and administration of civil government. He who is born in the purple is seldom worthy to reign, but the elevation of a private man, of a peasant, perhaps, or a slave, affords a strong presumption of his courage and capacity. The viceroy of a remote kingdom aspires to secure the property and inheritance of his precarious trust. The nations must rejoice in the presence of their sovereign, and the command of armies and treasures are at once the object and the instrument of his ambition. A change was scarcely visible as long as the lieutenants of the caliph were content with their vicarious title, while they solicited for themselves or their sons a renewal of the imperial grant, and still maintained on the coin and in public prayers the name and prerogative of the commander of the faithful. But in the long and hereditary exercise of power they assumed the pride and attributes of royalty. The alternative of peace or war, of reward and punishment, depended solely on their will, and the revenues of their government were reserved for local services or private magnificence. Instead of a regular supply of men and money, the successors of the prophet were flattered with the ostentatious gift of an elephant, or a cast of hawks, a suit of silk hangings, or some pounds of musk and amber. After the revolt of Spain from the temporal and spiritual supremacy of the Abbassides, the first symptoms of disobedience broke forth in the province of Africa. Ibrahim, the son of Aglab, the lieutenant of the vigilant and rigid Harun, bequeathed to the dynasty of Aglabites the inheritance of his name and power. The indolence or policy of the caliphs dissembled the injury and loss, and pursued only with poison the founder of the Idrisites, who erected the kingdom and city of Fez on the shores of the Western Ocean. In the East, the first dynasty was that of the Tahirites, the posterity of the valiant Taha, who, in the civil wars of the sons of Harun, had served with too much zeal and success the cause of Almamon, the younger brother. He was sent into honorable exile to command on the banks of the Oxus, and the independence of his successors, who reigned in Khorasan till the fourth generation, was palliated by their modest and respectful demeanor, the happiness of their subjects, and the security of their frontier. They were supplanted by one of those adventurers so frequent in the annals of the East, who left his trade of a brazier, from whence the name of Sopharides, for the profession of a robber. In a nocturnal visit to the treasure of the prince of Sistan, Jacob, the son of Leith, stumbled over a lump of salt, which he unwarily tasted with his tongue. Salt, among the Orientals, is the symbol of hospitality, and the pious robber immediately retired without spoil or damage. The discovery of this honorable behavior recommended Jacob pardon and trust. He led an army at first for his benefactor, at last for himself, subdued Persia, and threatened the residence of the Abbassides. On his march towards Bagdad, the conqueror was arrested by a fever. He gave audience in bed to the ambassador of the caliph, and beside him on a table were exposed a naked scimitar, a crust of brown bread, and a bunch of onions. "If I die," said he, "your master is delivered from his fears. If I live, this must determine between us. If I am vanquished, I can return without reluctance to the homely fare of my youth." From the height where he stood, the descent would not have been so soft or harmless. A timely death secured his own repose and that of the caliph, who paid with the most lavish concessions the retreat of his brother Amrou to the palaces of Shiraz and Ispahan. The Abbassides were too feeble to contend, too proud to forgive. They invited the powerful dynasty of the Samanides, who passed the Oxus with 10,000 horse, so poor that their stirrups were of wood, so brave that they vanquished the Soffarian army, 8 times more numerous than their own. The captive Amrou was sent in chains, a grateful offering to the court of Bagdad, and as the victor was content with the inheritance of Transoxiana and Khorasan, the realms of Persia returned for a while to the allegiance of the caliphs. The provinces of Syria and Egypt were twice dismembered by the Turkish slaves of the race of Toulon and Ilkshid. These barbarians, in religion and manners the countrymen of Mahomet, emerged from the bloody factions of the palace to a provincial command and independent throne. Their names became famous and formidable in their time, but the founders of these two potent dynasties confessed, either in words or actions, the vanity of ambition. The first on his deathbed implored the mercy of God to a sinner, ignorant of the limits of his own power. The second, in the midst of 400,000 soldiers and 8,000 slaves, concealed from every human eye the chamber where he attempted to sleep. Their sons were educated in the vices of kings, and both Egypt and Syria were recovered and possessed by the Abbassides during an interval of 30 years. In the decline of the empire, Mesopotamia, with the important cities of Mosul and Aleppo, was occupied by the Arabian princes of the tribe of Hamadan. The poets of their court could repeat without a blush that nature had formed their countenances for beauty, their tongues for eloquence, and their hands for liberality and valor. But the genuine tale of the elevation and reign of the Hamadanites exhibits a scene of treachery, murder, and parricide. At the same fatal period, the Persian kingdom was again usurped by the dynasty of the Bowides, by the sword of three brothers, who, under various names, were styled the support and columns of the state, and who, from the Caspian Sea to the ocean, would suffer no tyrants but themselves. Under their reign, the language and genius of Persia revived, and the Arabs, 304 years after the death of Mahomet, were deprived of the sceptre of the East. Rahadi, the 20th of the Abbassides, and the 39th of the successors of Mahomet, was the last who deserved the title of Commander of the Faithful. The last, says Abu Feda, who spoke to the people, or conversed with the learned; the last who, in the expense of his household, represented the wealth and magnificence of the ancient caliphs. After him, the lords of the Eastern world were reduced to the most abject misery, and exposed to the blows and insults of a servile condition. The revolt of the provinces circumscribed their dominions without the walls of Bagdad; but that capital still contained an innumerable multitude, vain of their past fortune, discontented with their present state, and oppressed by the demands of a treasury which had formerly been replenished by the spoil and tribute of nations. Their idleness was exercised by faction and controversy. Under the mask of piety, the rigid followers of Hanbal invaded the pleasures of domestic life, burst into the houses of plebeians and princes. The wine broke the instruments, beat the musicians, and dishonored, with infamous suspicions, the associates of every handsome youth. In each profession, which allowed room for two persons, the one was a votary, the other an antagonist, of Ali, and the Abbassides were awakened by the clamorous grief of the sectaries, who denied their title and cursed their progenitors. A turbulent people could only be repressed by a military force, but who could satisfy their avarice or assert the discipline of the mercenaries themselves? The African and the Turkish guards drew their swords against each other, and the chief commanders, the emirs al Omra, imprisoned or deposed their sovereigns, and violated the sanctuary of the mosque and harem. If the caliphs escaped to the camp or court of any neighboring prince, their deliverance was a change of servitude, till they were prompted by despair to invite the Bowides, the sultans of Persia, who silenced the factions of Bagdad by their irresistible arms. The civil and military powers were assumed by Moez al Dowlat, the second of the three brothers, and a stipend of 60,000 pounds sterling was assigned, by his generosity, for the private expense of the commander of the faithful. But on the 40th day, at the audience of the ambassadors of Chorasan, and in the presence of a trembling multitude, the caliph was dragged from his throne to a dungeon, by the command of the stranger and the rude hands of his diplemates. His palace was pillaged, his eyes were put out, and the mean ambition of the Abbassides aspired to the vacant station of danger and disgrace. In the school of adversity, the luxurious caliphs resumed the grave and abstemious virtues of the primitive times. Despoiled by their armor and silken robes, they fasted, they prayed, they studied the Koran and the tradition of the Sunnites. They performed, with zeal and knowledge, the functions of their ecclesiastical character. The respect of nations still waited on the successors of the apostle, the oracles of the law and conscience of the faithful, and the weakness or division of their tyrants sometimes restored the Abbassides to the sovereignty of Bagdad. But their misfortunes had been embittered by the triumph of the Fatimites, the real or spurious progeny of Ali. Arising from the extremity of Africa, these successful rivals extinguished, in Egypt and Syria, both the spiritual and temporal authority of the Abbassides, and the monarch of the Nile insulted the humble pontiff on the banks of the Tigris. In the declining age of the caliphs, in the century which elapsed after the war of Theophilus and Motassem, the hostile transactions of the two nations were confined to some inroads by sea and land, the fruits of their close vicinity and indelible hatred. But when the Eastern world was convulsed and broken, the Greeks were roused from their lethargy by the hopes of conquest and revenge. The Byzantine empire, since the accession of the Basilian race, had reposed in peace and dignity, and they might encounter with their entire strength the front of some petty emir, whose rear was as assaulted and threatened by his national foes of the Mahometan faith. The lofty titles of the Morning Star and the death of the Saracens were applied in the public acclamations to Nicephorus Phocas, a prince as renowned in the camp as he was unpopular in the city. In the subordinate station of great domestic, or general of the East, he reduced the island of Crete and extirpated the nest of pirates who had so long defied, with impunity, the majesty of the empire. His military genius was displayed in the conduct and success of the enterprise, which had so often failed with loss and dishonor. The Saracens were confounded by the landing of his troops on safe and level bridges, which he cast from the vessels to the shore. 7 months were consumed in the siege of Candia. The despair of the native Cretans was stimulated by the frequent aid of their brethren of Africa and Spain; and after the massive wall and double ditch had been stormed by the Greeks, a hopeless conflict was still maintained in the streets and houses of the city. The whole island was subdued in the capital, and a submissive people accepted, without resistance, the baptism of the conqueror. Constantinople applauded the long forgotten pomp of a triumph, but the imperial diadem was the sole reward that could repay the services, or satisfy the ambition, of Nicephorus. After the death of the younger Romanus, the fourth in lineal descent of the Basilian race, his widow, Theophania, successively married Nicephorus Phocas and his assassin John Zimisces, the two heroes of the age. They reigned as the guardians and colleagues of her infant sons, and the 12 years of their military command form the most splendid period of the Byzantine annals. The subjects and confederates whom they led to war appeared, at least in the eyes of an enemy, 200,000 strong, and of these about 30,000 were armed with cuirasses. A train of 4,000 mules attended their march, and their evening camp was regularly fortified with an enclosure of iron spikes. A series of bloody and undecisive combats is nothing more than an anticipation of what would have been effected in a few years by the course of nature. But I shall briefly prosecute the conquest of the two emperors from the hills of Cappadocia to the desert of Bagdad. The sieges of Mopsuestia and Tarsus in Cilicia first exercised the skill and perseverance of their troops, on whom, at this moment, I shall not hesitate to bestow the name of Romans. In the double city of Mopsuestia, which is divided by the river Sarus, 200,000 Moslems were predestined to death or slavery, a surprising degree of population, which must at least include the inhabitants of the dependent districts. They were surrounded and taken by assault, but Tarsus was reduced by the slow progress of famine. and no sooner had the Saracens yielded on honorable terms than they were mortified by the distant and unprofitable view of the naval succors of Egypt. They were dismissed with a safe conduct to the confines of Syria; a part of the old Christians had quietly lived under their dominion, and the vacant habitations were replenished by a new colony. But the mosque was converted into a stable, the pulpit was delivered to the flames, many rich crosses of gold and gems, the spoils of Asiatic churches, were made a grateful offering to the piety or avarice of the emperor, and he transported the gates of Mopsuestia and Tarsus, which were fixed in the walls of Constantinople, an eternal monument of his victory. After they had forced and secured the narrow passes of Mount Amanus, the two Roman princes repeatedly carried their arms into the heart of Syria. Yet, instead of assaulting the walls of Antioch, the humanity or superstition of Nicephorus appeared to respect the ancient metropolis of the East. He contented himself with drawing round the city a line of circumvallation, left a stationary army, and instructed his lieutenant to expect without impatience the return of spring. But in the depth of winter, in a dark and rainy night, an adventurous subaltern, with 300 soldiers, approached the rampart, applied his scaling ladders, occupied two adjacent towers, stood firm against the pressure of multitudes, and bravely maintained his post till he was relieved by the tardy, though effectual, support of his reluctant chief. The first tumult of slaughter and rapine subsided; the reign of Caesar and of Christ was restored; and the efforts of 100,000 Saracens, of the armies of Syria and the fleets of Africa, were consumed without effect before the walls of Antioch. The royal city of Aleppo was subject to Seyf ad-Dowlat, of the dynasty of Hamadan, who clouded his past glory by the precipitate retreat which abandoned his kingdom and capital to the Roman invaders. In his stately palace that stood without the walls of Aleppo, they joyfully seized a well furnished magazine of arms, a stable of 1,400 mules, and 300 bags of silver and gold. But the walls of the city withstood the strokes of their battering rams, and the besiegers pitched their tents on the neighboring mountain of Jaushan. Their retreat exasperated the quarrel of the townsmen and mercenaries. The guard of the gates and ramparts was deserted, and while they furiously charged each other in the marketplace, they were surprised and destroyed by the sword of a common enemy. The male sex was exterminated by the sword; 10,000 youths were led into captivity. The weight of the precious spoil exceeded the strength and number of the beasts of burden. The superfluous remainder was burnt, and, after a licentious possession of 10 days, the Romans marched away from the naked and bleeding city. In their Syrian inroads they commanded the husbandmen to cultivate their lands, that they themselves, in the ensuing season, might reap the benefit. More than 100 cities were reduced to obedience, and 18 pulpits of the principal mosques were committed to the flames, to expiate the sacrilege of the disciples of Mahomet. The classic names of Hierapolis, Apamea, and Emesa revived for a moment in the list of conquest. The emperor Zimisces encamped in the paradise of Damascus, and accepted the ransom of a submissive people. And the torrent was only stopped by the impregnable fortress of Tripoli, on the seacoast of Phoenicia. Since the days of Heraclius the Euphrates, below the passage of Mount Taurus, had been impervious and almost invisible to the Greeks. The river yielded a free passage to the victorious Zimisces, and the historian may imitate the speed with which he overran the once famous cities of Samosata, Edessa, Martyropolis, Amida, and Nisibis, the ancient limit of the empire in the neighborhood of the Tigris. His ardor was quickened by the desire of grasping the virgin treasures of Ecbatana, a well known name, under which the Byzantine writer has concealed the capital of the Abbassides. The consternation of the fugitives had already diffused the terror of his name, but the fancied riches of Bagdad had already been dissipated by the avarice and prodigality of domestic tyrants. The prayers of the people, and the stern demands of the lieutenant of the Bowides, required the caliph to provide for the defence of the city. The helpless Mothi replied that his arms, his revenues, and his provinces had been torn from his hands, and that he was ready to abdicate a dignity which he was unable to support. The emir was inexorable, the furniture of the palace was sold, and the paltry price of 40,000 pieces of gold was instantly consumed in private luxury. But the apprehensions of Bagdad were relieved by the retreat of the Greeks. Thirst and hunger guarded the desert of Mesopotamia; and the emperor, satiated with glory, and laden with oriental spoils, returned to Constantinople, and displayed, in his triumph, the silk, the aromatics, and 300 myriads of gold and silver. Yet the powers of the East had been bent, not broken, by this transient hurricane. After the departure of the Greeks, the fugitive princes returned to their capitals; the subjects disclaimed their involuntary oaths of allegiance; the Moslems again purified their temples, and overturned the idols of the saints and martyrs; the Nestorians and Jacobites preferred a Saracen to an orthodox master; and the numbers and spirit of the Melchites were inadequate to the support of the church and state. Of these extensive conquests, Antioch, with the cities of Cilicia and the Isle of Cyprus, was alone restored, a permanent and useful accession to the Roman empire. Chapter 52, part 5.
Part 1 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5, Chapter 53, Fate of the Eastern Empire, Part 1. Fate of the Eastern Empire in the 10th century. Extent and division. Wealth and revenue. Palace of Constantinople. Titles and offices. Pride and power of the emperors. Tactics of the Greeks, Arabs, and Franks. Loss of the Latin tongue. Studies and solitude of the Greeks. A ray of historic light seems to beam from the darkness of the 10th century. We open with curiosity and respect the royal volumes of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, which he composed at a mature age for the instruction of his son, and which promise to unfold the state of the Eastern Empire, both in peace and war, both at home and abroad. In the first of these works he minutely describes the pompous ceremonies of the church and palace of Constantinople, according to his own practice and that of his predecessors. In the second he attempts an accurate survey of the provinces, the themes, as they were denominated, both of Europe and Asia. The system of Roman tactics, the discipline and order of the troops, and the military operations by land and sea, are explained in the third of these didactic collections, which may be ascribed to Constantine or his father Leo. In the fourth, of the administration of the empire, he reveals the secrets of the Byzantine policy, in friendly or hostile intercourse with the nations of the earth. The literary labours of the age, the practical systems of law, agriculture, and history, might redound to the benefit of the subject and the honour of the Macedonian princes. The 60 books of the Basilics, the Code and Pandex of civil jurisprudence, were gradually framed in the 3 first regions of that prosperous dynasty. The art of agriculture had amused the leisure and exercised the pens of the best and wisest of the ancients, and their chosen precepts are comprised in the 20 books on the Geoponics of Constantine. At his command, the historical examples of vice and virtue were methodized in 53 books, and every citizen might apply, to his contemporaries or to himself, the lesson or the warning of past times. From the august character of a legislator, the sovereign of the East descends to the more humble office of a teacher and a scribe; and if his successors and subjects were regardless of his paternal cares, we may inherit and enjoy the everlasting legacy. A closer survey will indeed reduce the value of the gift, and the gratitude of posterity. In the possession of these imperial treasures, we may still deplore our poverty and ignorance, and the fading glories of their authors will be obliterated by indifference or contempt. The Basilics will sink to a broken copy, a partial and mutilated version, in the Greek language, of the laws of Justinian. But the sense of the old civilians is often superseded by the influence of bigotry, and the absolute prohibition of divorce, concubinage, and interest for money, enslaves the freedom of trade and the happiness of private life. In the historical book, a subject of Constantine might admire the inimitable virtues of Greece and Rome. He might learn to what a pitch of energy and elevation the human character had formerly aspired. But a contrary effect must have been produced by a new edition of the Lives of the Saints, which the great logothete, or chancellor of the empire, was directed to prepare, and the dark fund of superstition was enriched by the fabulous and florid legends of Simon the Metaphrased. The merits and miracles of the whole calendar are of less account in the eye of a sage than the toil of a single husbandman, who multiplies the gifts of the Creator and supplies the food of his brethren. Yet the royal authors of the Geoponics were more seriously employed in expounding the precepts of the destroying art, which had been taught since the days of Xenophon as the art of heroes and kings. But the tactics of Leo and Constantine are mingled with the baser alloy of the age in which they lived. It was destitute of original genius. They implicitly transcribed the rules and maxims which had been confirmed by victories. It was unskilled in the propriety of style and method. They blindly confounded the most distant and discordant institutions. The phalanx of Sparta and that of Macedon, the legions of Cato and Trajan, of Augustus and Theodosius. Even the use, or at least the importance, of these military rudiments may be fairly questioned. Their general theory is dictated by reason, but the merit, as well as difficulty, consists in the application. The discipline of a soldier is formed by exercise rather than by study. The talents of a commander are appropriated to those calm, though rapid, minds which nature produces to decide the fate of armies and nations. The former is the habit of a life, the latter the glance of a moment, and the battles won by lessons of tactics may be numbered with the epic poems created for the rules of criticism. The Book of Ceremonies is a recital, tedious yet imperfect, of the despicable pageantry which had infected the church and state since the gradual decay of the purity of the one and the power of the other. A review of the themes or provinces might promise such authentic and useful information as the curiosity of government only can obtain, instead of traditionary fables on the origin of the cities, and malicious epigrams on the vices of their inhabitants. Such information the historian would have been pleased to record. Nor should his silence be condemned, if the most interesting objects, the population of the capital and provinces, the amount of the taxes and revenues, the numbers of subjects and strangers who served under the imperial standard, have been unnoticed by Leo the philosopher and his son Constantine. His treatise of the public administration is stained with the same blemishes, yet it is discriminated by peculiar merit. The antiquities of the nations may be doubtful or fabulous, but the geography and manners of the barbaric world are delineated with curious accuracy. Of these nations, the Franks alone were qualified to observe in their turn, and to describe, the metropolis of the East. The ambassador of the great Otho, a bishop of Cremona, has painted the state of Constantinople about the middle of the 10th century. His style is glowing, his narrative lively, his observations keen, and even the prejudices and passions of Liutprand are stamped with an original character of freedom and genius. From this scanty fund of foreign and domestic materials, I shall investigate the form and substance of the Byzantine Empire, the provinces and wealth, the civil government and military force, the character and literature of the Greeks in a period of 600 years, from the reign of Heraclius to his successful invasion of the Franks or Latins. After the final division between the sons of Theodosius, the swarms of barbarians from Scythia and Germany overspread the provinces and extinguished the empire of ancient Rome. The weakness of Constantinople was concealed by extent of dominion. Her limits were inviolate, or at least entire. And the kingdom of Justinian was enlarged by the splendid acquisition of Africa and Italy. But the possession of these new conquests were transient and precarious, and almost a moiety of the Eastern Empire was torn away by the arms of the Saracens. Syria and Egypt were oppressed by the Arabian caliphs, and, after the reduction of Africa, their lieutenants invaded and subdued the Roman province, which had been changed into the Gothic monarchy of Spain. The islands of the Mediterranean were not inaccessible to their naval powers, and it was from their extreme stations, the harbours of Crete and the fortress of Sicilia, that the faithful or rebel emirs insulted the majesty of the throne and capital. The remaining provinces, under the obedience of the emperors, were cast into a new mould, and the jurisdiction of the presidents, the consulars, and the counts was superseded by the institution of the themes or military governments which prevailed under the successors of Heraclius, and are described by the pen of the royal author. Of the 29 themes, 12 in Europe and 17 in Asia, the origin is obscure, the etymology doubtful or capricious, the limits were arbitrary and fluctuating, but some particular names, that sound the most strangely to our ear, were derived from the character and attributes of the troops that were maintained at the expense, and for the guard, of the respective divisions. The vanity of the Greek princes most eagerly grasped the shadow of conquest and the memory of lost dominion. A new Mesopotamia was created on the western side of the Euphrates. The appellation and praetor of Sicily were transferred to a narrow slip of Calabria, and a fragment of the duchy of Beneventum was promoted to the style and title of the theme of Lombardy. In the decline of the Arabian Empire, the successors of Constantine might not indulge their pride in more solid advantages. The victories of Nicephorus, John Zimisces, and Basil II revived the fame and enlarged the boundaries of the Roman name. The province of Cilicia, the islands of Crete and Cyprus, were restored to the allegiance of Christ and Caesar. 1/3 of Italy was annexed to the throne of Constantinople. The kingdom of Bulgaria was destroyed, and the last sovereigns of the Macedonian dynasty extended their sway from the sources of the Tigris to their neighbourhood of Rome. In the 11th century, the prospect was again clouded by new enemies and new misfortunes. The relics of Italy were swept away by the Norman adventurers, and almost all the Asiatic branches were dissevered from the Roman trunk by the Turkish conquerors. After these losses, the emperors of the Comnenian family continued to reign from the Danube to Peloponnesus, and from Belgrade to Nice, Trebizond, and the winding stream of the Meander. The spacious provinces of Thrace, Macedonia, and Greece were obedient to their sceptre. The possession of Cyprus, Rhodes, and Crete was accompanied by the 50 islands of the Aegean or Holy See, and the remnant of their empire transcends the measure of the largest of the European kingdoms. The same princes might assert, with dignity and truth, that of all the monarchs of Christendom, they possessed the greatest city, the most ample revenue, the most flourishing and populous state. With the decline and fall of the empire, the cities of the West had decayed and fallen, nor could the ruins of Rome, or the mud walls, wooden hovels, and narrow precincts of Paris and London prepare the Latin stranger to contemplate the situation and extent of Constantinople, her stately palaces and churches, and the arts and luxury of an innumerable people. Her treasures might attract, but her virgin strength had repelled, and still promised to repel, the audacious invasion of the Persian and Bulgarian, the Arab and the Russian. The provinces were less fortunate and impregnable, and few districts, few cities, could be discovered which had not been violated by some fierce barbarian, impatient to despoil, because he was hopeless to possess. From the age of Justinian, the Eastern Empire was sinking below its former level. The powers of destruction were more active than those of improvement, and the calamities of war were embittered by the more permanent evils of civil and ecclesiastical tyranny. The captive who had escaped from the barbarians was often stripped and imprisoned by the ministers of his sovereign. The Greek superstition relaxed the mind by prayer, and emaciated the body by fasting. And the multitude of convents and festivals diverted many hands and many days from the temporal service of mankind. Yet the subjects of the Byzantine Empire were still the most dexterous and diligent of nations. Their country was blessed by nature with every advantage of soil, climate, and situation; and, in the support and restoration of the arts, their patient and peaceful temper was more useful than the warlike spirit and feudal anarchy of Europe. The provinces that still adhered to the empire were repeopled and enriched by the misfortunes of those which were irrevocably lost. From the yoke of the caliphs, the Catholics of Syria, Egypt, and Africa retired to the allegiance of their prince, to the society of their brethren. The movable wealth, which eludes the search of oppression, accompanied and alleviated their exile; and Constantinople received into her bosom the fugitive trade of Alexandria and Tyre. The chiefs of Armenia and Scythia, who fled from hostile or religious persecution, were hospitably entertained. Their followers were encouraged to build new cities and to cultivate waste lands; and many spots, both in Europe and Asia, preserve the name, the manners, or at least the memory, of these national colonies. Even the tribes of barbarians, who had seated themselves in arms on the territory of the empire, were gradually reclaimed to the laws of the church and state; and as long as they were separated from the Greeks, their posterity supplied a race of faithful and obedient soldiers. Did we possess sufficient materials to survey the 29 themes of the Byzantine monarchy, our curiosity might be satisfied with a chosen example. It is fortunate enough that the clearest light should be thrown on the most interesting province, and the name of Peloponnesus will awaken the attention of the classic reader. As early as the 8th century, in the troubled reign of the Iconoclasts, Greece, and even Peloponnesus, were overrun by some Sclavonian bands, who outstripped the royal standard of Bulgaria. The strangers of old, Cadmus, and Danaus, and Pelops, had planted in that fruitful soil the seeds of policy and learning; but the savages of the north eradicated what yet remained of their sickly and withered roots. In this irruption, the country and the inhabitants were transformed, the Grecian blood was contaminated, and the proudest nobles of Peloponnesus were branded with the names of foreigners and slaves. By the diligence of succeeding princes, the land was in some measure purified from the barbarians, and the humble remnant was bound by an oath of obedience, tribute, and military service, which they often renewed and often violated. The siege of Patras was formed by a singular occurrence of the Sclavonians of Peloponnesus and the Saracens of Africa. In their latest distress, a pious fiction of the approach of the praetor of Corinth revived the courage of the citizens. Their sally was bold and successful. The strangers embarked, the rebels submitted, and the glory of the day was ascribed to a phantom or a stranger, who fought in the foremost ranks under the character of St. Andrew the Apostle. The shrine, which contained his relics, was decorated with the trophies of victory, and the captive race was forever devoted to the service and vassalage of the metropolitan church of Patras. By the revolt of the two Sclavian tribes, in the neighborhood of Hellas and Lacedaemon, the peace of the peninsula was often disturbed. They sometimes insulted the weakness, and sometimes resisted the oppression of the Byzantine government, till at length the approach of their hostile brethren extorted a golden bull to define the rights and obligations of the Ezrahites and Melengi, whose annual tribute was defined at 1,200 pieces of gold. From these strangers the imperial geographer has accurately distinguished a domestic and perhaps original race, who, in some degree, might derive their blood from the much injured Helots. The liberty of the Romans, and especially of Augustus, had enfranchised the maritime cities from the dominion of Sparta, and the continuance of the same benefit ennobled them with the title of Eleuthero, or free Laconians. In the time of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, they had acquired the name of Menoetis, under which they dishonor the claim of liberty by the inhuman pillage of all that is shipwrecked on their rocky shores. Their territory, barren of corn, but fruitful of olives, extended to the Cape of Malea. They accepted a chief or prince from the Byzantine praetor, and a light tribute of 400 pieces of gold was the badge of their immunity rather than of their dependence. The freemen of Laconia assumed the character of Romans, and long adhered to the religion of the Greeks. By the zeal of the Emperor Basil, they were baptized in the faith of Christ, but the altars of Venus and Neptune had been crowned by these rustic votaries 500 years after they were proscribed in the Roman world. In the theme of Peloponnesus, 40 cities were still numbered, and the declining state of Sparta, Argos, and Corinth may be suspended in the 10th century, at an equal distance, perhaps, between their antique splendor and their present desolation. The duty of military service, either in person or by substitute, was imposed on the lands or benefices of the province. A sum of 5 pieces of gold was assessed on each of the substantial tenants, and the same capitation was shared among several heads of inferior value. On the proclamation of an Italian war, the Peloponnesians excused themselves by a voluntary oblation of 100 pounds of gold, 4,000 pounds sterling, and 1,000 horses with their arms and trappings. The churches and monasteries furnished their contingent. A sacrilegious profit was extorted from the sale of ecclesiastical honors, and the indignant bishop of Leucada was made responsible for a pension of 100 pieces of gold. But the wealth of the province and the trust of the revenue were founded on the fair and plentiful produce of trade and manufacturers, and some symptoms of liberal policy may be traced in a law which exempts from all personal taxes the mariners of Peloponnesus, and the workmen in parchment and purple. This denomination may be fairly applied or extended to the manufacturers of linen, woollen, and more especially of silk, the two former of which had flourished in Greece since the days of Homer, and the last was introduced perhaps as early as the reign of Justinian. These arts, which were exercised at Corinth, Thebes, and Argos, afforded food and occupation to a numerous people. The men, women, and children were distributed according to their age and strength, and, if many of these were domestic slaves, their masters, who directed the work and enjoyed the profit, were of a free and honourable condition. The gifts which a rich and generous matron of Peloponnesus presented to the Emperor Basil, her adopted son, were doubtless fabricated in the Grecian looms. Danielis bestowed a carpet of fine wool, of a pattern which imitated the spots of a peacock's tail, of a magnitude to overspread the floor of a new church erected in the triple name of Christ, of Michael the Archangel, and of the prophet Elijah. She gave 600 pieces of silk and linen, of various use and denomination. The silk was painted with the Tyrian dye, and adorned by the labours of the needle, and the linen was so exquisitely fine that an entire piece might be rolled in the hollow of a cane. In his description of the Greek manufacturers, an historian of Sicily discriminates their price, according to the weight and quality of the silk, the closeness of the texture, the beauty of the colours, and the taste and materials of the embroidery. A single, or even a double or treble thread was thought sufficient for ordinary sale, but the union of 6 threads composed a piece of stronger and more costly workmanship, Among the colours, he celebrates, with affectation of eloquence, the fiery blaze of scarlet, and the softer lustre of the green. The embroidery was raised either in silk or gold. The more simple ornament of stripes or circles was surpassed by the nicer imitation of flowers. The vestments that were fabricated for the palace or for the altar often glittered with precious stones, and the figures were delineated in strings of oriental pearls. Till the 12th century, Greece alone, of all the countries of Christendom, was possessed of the instinct who is taught by nature, and of the workmen who are instructed by art to prepare this elegant luxury. But the secret had been stolen by the dexterity and diligence of the Arabs. The caliphs of the East and West scorned to borrow from the unbelievers their furniture and apparel, and 2 cities of Spain, Almeria and Lisbon, were famous for the manufacture, the use, and perhaps the exportation of silk. It was first introduced into Sicily by the Normans, and this emigration of trade distinguishes the victory of Roger from the uniform and fruitless hostilities of every age. After the sack of Corinth, Athens, and Thebes, his lieutenant embarked with a captive train of weavers and artificers of both sexes, a trophy glorious to their master and disgraceful to the Greek emperor. The king of Sicily was not insensible of the value of the present, and, in the restitution of the prisoners, he accepted only the male and female manufacturers of Thebes and Corinth, who labour, says the Byzantine historian, under a barbarous lord, like the old Eretrians in the service of Darius. A stately edifice, in the palace of Palermo, was erected for the use of this industrious colony, and the art was propagated by their children and disciples to satisfy the increasing demand of the Western world. The decay of the looms of Sicily may be ascribed to the troubles of the island, and the competition of the Italian cities. In the year 1314, Lucca alone, among her sister republics, enjoyed the lucrative monopoly. A domestic revolution dispersed the manufacturers to Florence, Bologna, Venice, Milan, and even the countries beyond the Alps; and 13 years after this event, the statutes of Modena enjoined the planting of mulberry trees, and regulated the duties on raw silk. The northern climates are less propitious to the education of the silkworm, but the industry of France and England is supplied and enriched by the productions of Italy and China. Chapter 53, Part 1. Part 2 of the History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lizzie Driver. The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Volume 5. Chapter 53. Fate of the Eastern Empire, Part 2. I must repeat the complaint that the vague and scanty memorials of the times will not afford any just estimate of the taxes, the revenue, and the resources of the Greek empire. From every province of Asia and Europe, the rivulets of gold and silver discharged into the imperial reservoir a copious and perennial stream. The separation of the branches from the trunk increased the relative magnitude of Constantinople, and the maxims of despotism contracted the state to the capital to the palace, and the palace to the royal person. A Jewish traveller, who visited the East in the 12th century, is lost in his admiration of the Byzantine riches. "It is here," says Benjamin of Tudela, "in the Queen of Cities, that the tributes of the Greek empire are annually deposited, and the lofty towers are filled with precious magazines of silk, purple, and gold. It is said that Constantinople pays each day to her sovereign 20,000 pieces of gold, which are levied on the shops, taverns, and markets, on the merchants of Persia and Egypt, of Russia and Hungary, of Italy and Spain, who frequent the capital by sea and land. In all pecuniary matters, the authority of a Jew is doubtless respectable; but as the 365 days would produce an yearly income exceeding 7 millions sterling, I am tempted to retrench at least the numerous festivals of the Greek calendar. The mass of treasure that was saved by Theodora and Basil II. Will suggest a splendid, though indefinite, idea of their supplies and resources. The mother of Michael, before she retired to a cloister, attempted to check or expose the prodigality of her ungrateful son, by a free and faithful account of the wealth which he inherited, 109,000 pounds of gold, and 300,000 of silver, the fruits of her own economy and that of her deceased husband. The avarice of Basil is not less renowned than his valour and fortune. His victorious armies were paid and rewarded without breaking into the mass of 200,000 pounds of gold, about 8 millions sterling, which he had buried in the subterraneous vaults of the palace. Such accumulation of treasure is rejected by the theory and practice of modern policy, and we are more apt to compute the national riches by the use and abuse of the public credit. Yet the maxims of antiquity are still embraced by a monarch formidable to his enemies, by a republic respectable to her allies, and both have attained their respective ends of military power and domestic tranquillity. Whatever might be consumed for the present wants, or reserved for the future use, of the state, the first and most sacred demand was for the pomp and pleasure of the emperor, and his discretion only could define the measure of his private expense. The princes of Constantinople were far removed from the simplicity of nature, yet, with the revolving seasons, they were led by taste or fashion to withdraw to a purer air from the smoke and tumult of the capital. They enjoyed, or affected to enjoy, the rustic festival of the vintage; their leisure was amused by the exercise of the chase and the calmer occupation of fishing, and in the summer heats they were shielded from the sun and refreshed by the cooling breezes from the sea. The coasts and islands of Asia and Europe were covered with their magnificent villas, but, instead of the modest art which secretly strives to hide itself and to decorate the scenery of nature, the marble structure of their gardens served only to expose the riches of the lord and the labours of the architect. The successive casualties of inheritance and forfeiture had rendered the sovereign proprietor of many stately houses in the city and suburbs, of which 12 were appropriated to the ministers of state. But the great palace, the centre of the imperial residence, was fixed during 11 centuries to the same position, between the hippodrome, the cathedral of St. Sophia, and the gardens, which descended by many a terrace to the shores of the Propontis. The primitive edifice of the first Constantine was a copy or rival of ancient Rome. The gradual improvements of his successors aspired to emulate the wonders of the old world, and in the 10th century the Byzantine palace excited the admiration, at least of the Latins, by an unquestionable preeminence of strength, size, and magnificence. But the toil and treasure of so many ages had produced a vast and irregular pile. Each separate building was marked with the character of the times and of the founder, and the want of space might excuse the reigning monarch, who demolished, perhaps with secret satisfaction, the works of his predecessors. The economy of the Emperor Theophilus allowed a more free and ample scope for his domestic luxury and splendour. A favourite ambassador, who had astonished the Abbassides themselves by his pride and liberality, presented on his return the model of a palace, which the Caliph of Bagdad had recently constructed on the banks of the Tigris. The model was instantly copied and surpassed. The new buildings of Theophilus were accompanied with gardens, and with 5 churches, one of which was conspicuous for size and beauty. It was crowned with 3 domes, the roof of gilt brass reposed on columns of Italian marble, and the walls were encrusted with marbles of various colours. In the face of the church, a semicircular portico, of the figure and name of the Greek Sigma, was supported by 15 columns of Phrygian marble, and the subterraneous vaults were of a similar construction. The square before the sigma was decorated with a fountain, and the margin of the basin was lined and encompassed with plates of silver. In the beginning of each season, the basin, instead of water, was replenished with the most exquisite fruits, which were abandoned to the populace for the entertainment of the prince. He enjoyed this tumultuous spectacle from a throne resplendent with gold and gems, which was raised by a marble staircase to the height of a lofty terrace. Below the throne were seated the officers of his guard, the magistrates, the chiefs of the factions of the circus. The inferior steps were occupied by the people, and the place below was covered with troops of dancers, singers, and pantomimes. The square was surrounded by the Hall of Justice, the arsenal, and the various offices of business and pleasure, and the Purple Chamber was named from the annual distribution of robes of scarlet and purple by the hand of the empress herself. The long series of the apartments was adapted to the seasons, and decorated with marble and porphyry, with paintings, sculpture, and mosaics, with a profusion of gold, silver, and precious stones. His fanciful magnificence employed the skill and patience of such artists as the times could afford, but the taste of Athens would have despised their frivolous and costly labours. A golden tree, with its leaves and branches, which sheltered a multitude of birds warbling their artificial notes, and 2 lions of massy gold, and of natural size, who looked and roared like their brethren of the forest. The successors of Theophilus, of the Basilian and Comnenian dynasties, were not less ambitious of leaving some memorial of their residence, and the portion of the palace most splendid and august was dignified with the title of the Golden Triclinium. With becoming modesty, the rich and noble Greeks aspired to imitate their sovereign, and when they passed through the streets on horseback, in their robes of silk and embroidery, they were mistaken by the children for kings. A matron of Peloponnesus, who had cherished the infant fortunes of Basil the Macedonian, was excited by tenderness or vanity to visit the greatness of her adopted son. In a journey of 500 miles from Patras to Constantinople, her age or indolence declined the fatigue of a horse or carriage. The soft litter or bed of Danielis was transported on the shoulder of 10 robust slaves, and as they were relieved at easy distances, a band of 300 was selected for the performance of this service. She was entertained in the Byzantine palace with filial reverence and the honors of a queen, and whatever might be the origin of her wealth, her gifts were not unworthy of the regal dignity. I have already described the fine and curious manufactures of Peloponnesus, of linen, silk, and woollen, but the most acceptable of her presents consisted in 300 beautiful youths, of whom 100 were eunuchs, for she was not ignorant, says the historian, that the air of the palace is more congenial to such insects than a shepherd's dairy to the flies of the summer. During her lifetime she bestowed the greater part of her estates in Peloponnesus, and her testament insulted Leo, the son of Basil, her universal heir. After the payment of the legacies, 80 villas or farms were added to the imperial domain, and 3,000 slaves of Danielis were enfranchised by their new lord, and transported as a colony to the Italian coast. From this example of a private matron, we may estimate the wealth and magnificence of the emperors. Yet our enjoyments are confined by a narrow circle, and, whatsoever may be its value, the luxury of life is possessed with more innocence and safety by the master of his own house than by the steward of the public fortune. In an absolute government, which levels the distinction of noble and plebeian birth, the sovereign is the sole fountain of honour, and the rank, both in the palace and the empire, depends on the titles and offices which are bestowed and resumed by his arbitrary will. Above 1,000 years, from Vespasian to Alexis Comnenus, the Caesar was the second person, or at least the second degree, after the supreme title of Augustus was more freely communicated to the sons and brothers of the reigning monarch. To elude, without violating his promise to a powerful associate, the husband of his sister, and, without giving himself an equal, to reward the piety of his brother Isaac, the crafty Alexius interposed a new and supereminent dignity. The happy flexibility of the Greek tongue allowed him to compound the name of Augustus and Emperor, Sebestus and Autocrator, and the union produces the sonorous title of Sebestocrator. He was exalted above the Caesar on the first step of the throne, the public acclamations repeated his name, and he was only distinguished from the sovereign by some peculiar ornaments of the head and feet. The emperor alone could assume the purple or red buskins, and the close diadem or tiara, which imitated the fashion of the Persian kings. It was a high pyramidal cap of cloth or silk, almost concealed by a profusion of pearls and jewels. The crown was formed by a horizontal circle and two arches of gold. At the summit, the point of their intersection, was placed a globe or cross, and two strings or lappets of pearl depended on either cheek. Instead of red, the buskins of the Sebastocrator and Caesar were green, and on their open coronets or crowns, the precious gems were more sparingly distributed. Beside and below the Caesar, the fancy of Alexius created the Panhypersebastos and the Protosebastos, whose sound and signification will satisfy a Grecian ear. They imply a superiority and a priority above the simple name of Augustus, and this sacred and primitive title of the Roman prince was degraded to the kinsmen and servants of the Byzantine court. The daughter of Alexius applauds, with fond complacency, this artful gradation of hopes and honours. But the science of words is accessible to the meanest capacity, and this vain dictionary was easily enriched by the pride of his successors. To their favourite sons or brothers they imparted the more lofty appellation of lord or despot, which was illustrated with new ornaments and prerogatives, and placed immediately after the person of the emperor himself. The 5 titles of 1. Despot, 2. Sebastocrator, 3. Caesar, 4. Panhypersebastos, and 5. Protosebastos were usually confined to the princes of his blood. They were the emanations of his majesty, but as they exercised no regal functions, their existence was useless and their authority precarious. But in every monarchy the substantial powers of government must be divided and exercised by the ministers of the palace and treasury, the fleet and army. The titles alone can differ, and in the revolution of ages, the counts and prefects, the praetor and quaestor, insensibly descended, while their servants rose above their heads to the first honours of the state. 1. In a monarchy, which refers every object to the person of the prince, the care and ceremonies of the palace form the most respectable department. The curopalate, so illustrious in the age of Justinian, was supplanted by the protovestiare, whose primitive functions were limited to the custody of the wardrobe. From thence his jurisdiction was extended over the numerous menials of pomp and luxury, and he presided with a silver wand at the public and private audience. 2. In the ancient system of Constantine, the name of logothete or accountant was applied to the receivers of the finances. The principal officers were distinguished as the logothetes of the domain, of the posts, the army, the private and public treasure; and the great logothete, the supreme guardian of the laws and revenues, is compared with the chancellor of the Latin monarchies. His discerning eye pervaded the civil administration, and he was assisted, in due subordination, by the eparch or prefect of the city, the first secretary, and the keepers of the privy seal, the archives, and the red or purple ink, which was reserved for the sacred signature of the emperor alone. the introductor and interpreter of foreign ambassadors, were the great Chaucis and the dragoman, two names of Turkish origin, and which are still familiar to the Sublime Porte. 3. From the humble style and service of the guards, the domestics insensibly rose to the station of generals. The military themes of the East and West, the legion of Europe and Asia, were often divided, till the great domestic was finally invested with the universal and absolute command of the land forces. The protostrator, in his original functions, was the assistant of the emperor when he mounted on horseback. He gradually became the lieutenant of the great domestic in the field, and his jurisdiction extended over the stables, the cavalry, and the royal train of hunting and hawking. The stratopedarch was the great judge of the camp. The protospathaire commanded the guards. The constable, the great atriarch, and the acolyth were the separate chiefs of the Franks, the barbarians, and the varangi, or English, the mercenary strangers who, at the decay of the national spirit, formed the nerve of the Byzantine armies. 4. The naval powers were under the command of the great duke. In his absence they obeyed the great drungher of the fleet, and in his place the emir or admiral, a name of Saracen extraction, but which has been naturalized in all the modern languages of Europe. Of these officers, and of many more whom it would be useless to enumerate, the civil and military hierarchy was framed. Their honours and emoluments, their dress and titles, their mutual salutations and respective preeminence, were balanced with more exquisite labour than would have fixed the constitution of a free people; and the code was almost perfect when this baseless fabric, the monument of pride and servitude, was forever burned in the ruins of the empire. Chapter 53.